Lloyd Blankfein, thank you so much for joining us. So you wrote a new book, Streetwise, Getting to and Through Goldman Sachs. Why?
Well, first of all, I had the time. I found myself retired. It got to be a little bit COVID outside. There's a little bit, you don't, one day you're working full speed. The next day, there's kind of a tapering process. And so it gives you time to reflect, to think about things. Your friends are still your friends. You engage. People start telling you this story and that story. I mean, I'd love to tell you I felt I was burning with wisdom to share with the world. But really, you get goaded into stuff. It doesn't start out thinking that you're going to write a book. You start writing about anecdotes. You start writing about what you think made things work. And then after a while, you start to structure and say, there could be a book here.
But Lloyd, is it actually really difficult going from a high-powered job, one of the most powerful people on Wall Street, to retiring?
Yes. And sometimes it's not only hard at times, but sometimes you get regret. And every time I feel, gosh, I wish I was there. I can pick up one of the plastic phones of my grandkid that's connected to nothing and bark into it. But you get used to it. And also, when I start to miss it, I remind myself, something? I don't have to fly to Singapore tonight to pitch for something for 15 minutes, then turn around, get on the plane, and fly back and go to Germany, 2 days later. So, yes, I remind myself that there are reasons why it run its course. I did that for, I was in the firm almost 37, 38 years, and I was CEO for almost 13 of those years. So it was fine. It was time.
When you look at the world today, there's a big war in the Middle East. Yes. There's disruption with AI. We're uncertain where that goes, and of course, there's everything going on in private credit. Do you wish you were still in the game?
I wish I was. I mostly wish I was still in the game in these kinds of crises moments, because when things are going well, it's kind of easy. You get home in the end of the day and you're not sure what you did. I mean, it's more fun, and it's not like you volunteer for the problems. The problems come to you and find you, but at least there at the end of the day, you feel like you made a contribution that maybe somebody else wouldn't have done the same way, and it's more fun, and you get the sense of teamwork. So it's good, and you follow. Look, you're lucky. You live a life where the background noise of everything you do is the news of what's going on. That was my life as well. I never. It's perfectly polite in my line of work, and I'm sure yours as well, where even you're having a conversation and out of the corner of your eye, you're staring at a screen. And things are flashing and things are always going on. And if you have a job like mine, there's nothing that can go on anywhere in the world that doesn't affect you, given the size of our balance sheet and our interests. And, about 75% of the time, someone accuses you of causing whatever is going on in the world.
But because you've lived through the financial crisis, and a lot of chief executives, I think, will feel the stress of balancing speed with accuracy because things are going, very fast. What did you learn during the financial crisis that maybe chief executives can apply today?
Sometimes speed is liberating because you have no choice but to keep going. And it's not always that, you sit and you contemplate something and your anxiety takes over. And, sometimes you do things you need kind of courage because whenever you make a decision, it could be wrong. And so you're taking risks. But if you're under pressure and there's no time, there's a little bit of no choice, no problem. And so you go ahead. So sometimes things are unpleasant, but they're not hard because you have no choice.
Yeah, but today it feels hard because there's so much that could change, right? It's not one thing, it's three things.
Today you have to be, in this world, and as we sit here right at this moment, it can change on a dime. You can go from total pessimism to total optimism, back to pessimism, depending on the rhetoric that's flying back and forth. The rhetoric is flying in addition to missiles flying back and forth. Yes, it's. So I think today, what you really aren't is a forecaster or a predictor. You're really a contingency planner today. Okay. And if you contingency plan very well, when something happens, you can get off the mark so quickly that people think you predicted it. But you really didn't. You just made a lot of contingency plans. What if oil goes to 150? By the way, what if it goes back down to 70? Because that also can cause problems for people. And so you just have to have a plan for all these different contingencies that could happen. Yeah. And then there are contingencies that you couldn't have contemplated that could happen.
But so how do you describe markets today? Are they too volatile, or are they volatile enough?
Well, it is what it is. It can't be too volatile. It's up to you to cope with it. It's really difficult because there are a lot of contingencies, and the possibilities are really quite wide across. But there'll be, again, there are horses that do well in a race where it rains. Yeah. He'll go slower, but he'll do better than the other horses because they're used to running in mud. And we were always used to working in volatile markets like this.
What are private credits? Is it the new technology like junk bonds and CDOs were back in the day?
History doesn't repeat, but they rhyme. It could be kind of like that. I think one of the real issues is kind of it's private, a lack of transparency, and a lot of an inability to know what things are worth, because by the very nature, almost definitionally, they're illiquid, so they don't transact. The real way, people can mark themselves, and you can mark to model, and you can mark to an algorithm, and you can mark to an analogous security. But is that fair? Is that going to be right? The real way you know the value of what you have is if you sell some in the market, and then you know what a willing buyer would pay for it, so you know that that's the price of it. That doesn't happen a lot in these instruments because they don't transact. And also, sometimes in private credit, they're limited size, so there's not enough of it to justify another buyer coming in to buy a little smidgen of it to test the price.
So what does that mean? That we're going to see a similar boost and boom and bust kind of situation?
Well, what people are worried about is, are these things properly marked on the balance sheet of the holders? How do we know what they're worth? We have your word of it, and we're not necessarily saying you're fraudulent in any way, but how do you know what somebody else would pay for it till you test the market? That was the problem in the global, going back to the analogy of the global financial crisis. People had triple A securities. They had the imprimatur validated by rating agencies. But if you went in to sell it, nobody wanted it.
Right.
And so you kept going down. One of the things that was almost a religion we practiced at Goldman is that we really mark to market aggressively, daily, and where we didn't know something, of course, we had to use models and had to use analogous securities, but we made people go out and sell some. Mm-hmm. And that was a discipline that gave us kind of an early warning system that something was going on here. By the way, it wasn't necessarily a prediction of which way it would go, but when you have something marked at X and the highest bid that will come in from what you have is 0.8X, you know there's something going on here, and so you better figure out what's going on, or at least be cautious and not accumulate a lot of it.
But I mean, as we were reflecting on how the banks have changed since you were in charge of Goldman Sachs, I mean, banks have become more and more lenders to non-financial firms.
Yes.
That means a lot more risk. A
lot more risk. Now, I don't know. I didn't even know in the financial crisis what happens, because you do what you do, but you don't know what the aggregative is. My best thinking is that the banking system is not, famous last words, here's a prediction based upon just intuition and old experience, that the banks are not that leveraged to these firms. In other words, they're lending to them, but they're lending to them with a lot of value. These instruments could go down a lot before it affects the outcome of the banks. And that's a very significant thing. There's a very big difference today versus the global financial crisis, because that was a bad things going on, very recessionary, but it was a banking crisis. And in a bank, just remember, governments don't lend money to people. Central banks don't lend money to people. Banks do. Banks are the intermediary. They're the instrument by which the government could try to fix an economy that's in bad shape and in recession. And if the banking industry is in distress, you give money to banks, banks accumulate money, but they don't lend it out. They have to replenish their reserves so it lasts longer. Today, we're in a moment where the banks are doing well. We're not starting out with interest rates of zero. Interest rates are going down. The balance sheets are not great in banking, but for the U.S., it's lower than it has been. So, in other words, the official sector has a lot of tools it could use to remedy a bad economy, to work on it. Doesn't mean it'll be instantaneous, but there are a lot of tools that could be put into service, and the banks themselves are in much better shape. So I'm not saying that there won't be problems, but the problems will not cascade and snowball into a bigger problem, is what I think.
So you don't see anything systemic?
I don't see anything systemic, But, by the way, I didn't necessarily see anything systemic in the run-up to the crisis, which is why that's the nature of bubbles. Yeah. Everybody sees it in hindsight, but no one sees it in prospect.
Lloyd, how successful have financial markets been in reining in Trump's wilder impulses?
Well, I think I don't think we're reining in. I mean, look, a lot of the stuff that just betraying certain attitudes here. I think some of the actual outcomes and specific policies, are quite defensible. It doesn't mean that everybody's liking it. But he's addressing some things that need to be addressed. And then on the other side, he's also, let's say, challenging some norms and traditions and some safeguards and guardrails that, that some people include, that I even find some, alarming from time to time. And so, it's a bit of a balancing act. But I think sometimes some of the inconsistencies and media kinds of in the statements that go out. What's the cliche that's emerged? You take it. You don't take it literally, but you take it seriously.
Okay, and this is for everything that's happened in the price of oil, or also tariffs and trade?
Well, things can spiral out of someone's control. I mean, you have something. It's not as if you can have. Somebody can only convey his intentions, and you can decide whether you believe it, and that's really where he's coming from, because maybe there's some inconsistencies. But then there's another level. What if you absolutely knew intentions, but you lose the ability to control these things? You can't manufacture more supply of energy with your intentions. So, things can get out of control. And so, look, one thing when you compare crises and going back, we're in one that's unresolved. So it could get worse. And so, and by the way, this is the one we're in. So it's worse and it's scarier in terms of our attitude and our minds. But if we went back to the same place at the same time at the global financial crisis, that was much worse. But it's hard to be scared of something that's resolved on the shelf in a can, can't hurt you anymore, it's not going to get worse, you're just reading about it. And so we're living with something that you are not just marking yourself to market and how bad is it today, but we automatically extrapolate to where it could go. So we'll get through this also. Look, I joked, I said, that we had the crisis of the century every 4 or 5 years. Whether it was the long-term capital, the dot-com bubble, the Asian currency crisis. We haven't had one in a long time. By the way, that itself is a reason for concern. Because if you haven't had a crisis, it means you haven't had a reckoning. You haven't had a sell in distress, things that have accumulated on your balance sheet that might not be marked correctly. And the more time, the analogy I like to give is you accumulate tinder on the floor of the forest, and eventually a spark will come. But the longer between intervals where there's a spark that sets it on fire, the more that accumulates. We're coming off a period where we had the highest equity markets we've ever had and a very, very favorable financing market. Yet a lot of private equity firms have accumulated a lot of inventory of deals that they've gone into, been on their balance sheet. They're highly incented to sell them, but they haven't been sold. If they haven't been sold in a good equity environment, in a good financing environment, how easy it's going to be to sell them. And so why not? Maybe they're marked higher than what you could get in the market. So at some point, there needs to be a forcing function or a reckoning that causes you to come to grips with what your balance sheet really is worth.
But what's the hardest leadership lesson that you've learned that we can apply now? And you talk about this a little bit in the book. Is there, if you know that there's going to be a spark, should chief executives look for the sparks before they're ignited?
But really, I would say look for the kindling, because eventually there will always be a spark. And by the way, a spark that occurs when there's a lot of flammable material on the floor will set it ablaze, but if the material wasn't there, the spark would just happen and go by. It'll be something that in a different moment we might not have noticed, but it'll be, now to mix a metaphor, the last straw that causes it. Now you'll say, does the weight of the last straw really break the camel's back? No, it's just the incremental thing. So eventually, guaranteed, something will happen. What could it be? Could it be the realization that, there's overmarked things on balance sheets and, and that companies that are investors in these things have to write down certain investments? Could it be a hack, malevolent behavior and technology, a fat finger, an accident? Could it be the price of oil starts to look like it's sustainably going into 130, 140 in the consequence? Yes, it could be any one of these things. So at a different time, the market might be able to absorb that.
Right.
But if there's a lot of built up, let's say, assets and situations and contexts that have to be written down, then it'll be that kind of problem, and we'll wash out those problems with some disruption.
Lloyd, I mean, I imagine that as a chief executive, you always have to make decisions between sometimes like what's right and what's profitable, right? Have you ever been in a situation where you've stuck with someone who did something not great because they were making money?
I would say, if you mean by right, if you mean ethical, that's no issue at all. I mean, you can't run your business that way, especially in a business where your success and people's willingness to transact with you depends on your reputation for probity. So that's not an issue. However, some people could be difficult because they can answer your questions begrudgingly or be difficult with their colleagues. In other words, you could be wrong, but quite ethical, but also difficult. And at times, sometimes when people are pretty, have been pretty good and pretty, we've sort of overlooked it and say, gosh, we'll help this person, we'll reform this person, we'll give advice, we'll give mentorship, we'll get them a coach. And those generally work out badly because generally people's character is kind of set and you can change them a little bit, but not a lot. But if it starts to move across ethics, there's no question. That's easy. Unpleasant, but an easy decision.
Yeah, and I guess it's one of the questions also that a lot of these AI companies, right, have to grapple with. What's the most important management lesson that you've learned whilst managing others, managing people?
Some of these things are not good versus evil or right versus wrong. They're just competing values. So there's value of openness, and then there's a value of privacy. And they could be in conflict. And one is not right or one is not wrong. They're just values that are in conflict with each other. And how do you want to resolve the tension between those values?
But as the chief executive, it's down to you to decide what's most important.
Yes, but I think some of these things that they're asking executives to do are really for the political sector to decide. In other words, if you're trying to decide between competing values, that's what the political sector for is vote. The political sector in a lot of countries now is really can't get anything done. And so you're going down to business people and chief executives and make this decision. I always say, we're sitting here in London today, but I'm observing that a lot of pressures are being put in. There are companies that are under pressure. Don't finance gun manufacturers. Then the other half of the United States believes in the Second Amendment and it. So that's not right or wrong. There's just competing values, and those shouldn't be put on CEOs. That's for the political sector. But if you have a dysfunctional political sector, everyone goes to the CEO. I don't think you should have red companies and blue companies, and everyone should pick the company you want to deal with based upon their policies. I would like to see the political sector step up and resolve these value questions for the society.
Can anyone become a leader, or are you born with certain qualities?
I think everybody. My wife once wanted me to take tennis lessons so I could play with her well because she's a good tennis player. And I said, I'll never be good at this. She said, you're right. You'll never be good at this, but you can be better than you are. And so I would say that there are some people who start with a natural DNA and they're really, really good at it and have tendencies, and people who aren't as good. But even the people who aren't good could be better than they are.
Lloyd Blankfein, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much, Francine.